I never imagined greed could turn someone violent until the day my daughter-in-law broke my arm over a $4 million lottery ticket. I had waited my whole life for that moment, a dream finally realized, and suddenly it became a battlefield inside my own home. She stormed in like she owned everything, yanking and screaming, convinced that the money was hers by right. When I refused, she lashed out, and I hit the floor, the pain shooting through me. But even then, I saw the fire in her eyes, the kind of fire that thinks money can buy power, respect, and obedience all at once. The very next day, she dragged my son to the bank, acting as if I didn't exist, as if my rights, my voice, and my life were irrelevant. Their arrogance filled the air. "It's ours," they said. "We deserve it all." And for a moment, I felt a strange calm. They didn't know me. They didn't know that a quiet, patient mind can outmaneuver pride and force alike. I watched them approach the teller's desk, chest puffed out, sure of victory, completely unaware that they were about to face something they hadn't anticipated. Me prepared, steady, and unshakable. If you want to see exactly how I turned their cruelty and arrogance into a lesson they would never forget, how I reclaimed every bit of respect, dignity, and power they thought they could steal, stay with me. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel, Her Retaliation, because here, every story proves that patience, planning, and composure are stronger than anger, and far more lethal than brute force. They believed the bank would bend, that the law and reason could be ignored, that I would crumble under pressure. But I had spent weeks preparing, carefully building a web of documents, legal notices, and evidence that made their arrogance crumble before they even realized it. My son's confident smile faltered. My daughter-in-law's grip on the situation slipped as she saw, across that desk, the truth laid out with precise clarity. Pride is fragile, and that day, their pride shattered silently. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't even raise my voice. I simply let the facts speak, and as their eyes widened, panic creeping in where confidence had once been, I felt a cold satisfaction. Not hatred, not revenge for the sake of it. Just the quiet triumph of justice finally delivered. They had underestimated me. They assumed my age, my quiet demeanor, my calm, meant weakness. They couldn't have been more wrong. The moment they realized that nothing they had counted on would work was the exact moment I felt free. Free from fear, free from being belittled, free from letting anyone make me doubt my worth. That day, I understood something important. True power isn't loud. It doesn't shout or demand. True power is silent, deliberate, and unstoppable when applied with precision. So yes, they demanded everything, thinking they could take it all. But as they faced the evidence, their arrogance melted into disbelief. And as their pride crumbled, I knew this was only the beginning. This was the first strike, the quiet signal that greed and cruelty come with consequences, and I would make sure they understood that fully before it was over. The morning after the bank, my arm ached in places the doctors had warned me would remind me for months. Pain was a petty price for what I intended. Physical wounds heal, but humiliation can linger if you let it. I dressed slowly, not to hide injury but to present myself exactly as I wanted the world to see me. Composed, deliberate, unafraid. Wrapping the sling felt like putting on armor. I had learned long ago that presentation is not vanity, it's strategy. I started with the small, legal things that people forget until they cost them everything. While they imagined bravado would win the day, I had been quietly doing the work that would make their arrogance irrelevant. Weeks before the punch, I had gone through our files, reading every clause, every fine print my husband had trusted me with. He had been meticulous. I had kept his records. There was a trust deed tucked away, a conservatorship clause, investment paperwork naming beneficiaries, and a set of notarized letters that placed certain controls in my hands under specific conditions. I learned the language of those documents like a new dialect. It was patient work, the kind that requires evenings with a lamp and a steady hand. But patience had always been mine. My son had always assumed I was either too kind or too confused by numbers to notice. He thought my interest in the firm and the accounts was old, lady curiosity, a hobby without teeth. He was wrong. The day after the bank, I walked into the attorney's office with my sling and a quiet face, and I asked for a simple thing: activation of contingency clauses and verification of ownership. The lawyer looked at me with that mixture of surprise and professional respect that often follows people who have been underestimated. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said, soft, "are you sure you want to proceed?" I smiled at him, a small, sharp thing. "I want the truth established. That will be enough." We filed notices. We asked for audits. We began formal communications with the bank and the financial houses that managed the lottery funds. Nothing dramatic at first, a letter here, A certified notice there, but the kind of detail that makes people who act on impulse start to plan. I wasn't interested in scandal. I wanted procedure. Procedure is the language of permanence. While the lawyers did their careful work, I tended to my arm and my presence. I refused to be muffled or made small. I accepted friends who came with casseroles and advice. I refused pity. You did not break my spirit. I told one neighbor who tried to soothe me. You only reminded me it was still strong. Word spread, as it does, and people who had once been polite from habit began to watch more closely. Respect is contagious if you stand in it. At home, I planted seeds. Not vindictive ones, but seeds that would make truth visible. Little changes, correspondence left on the table with the envelope showing the bank's stamp, a printed ledger placed where visitors might see the care with which things had been managed for years, photographs of my husband at community events that demonstrated our family's real roots in this town. Visibility matters. Pride often thrives in shadow. They came at me again, of course. My daughter-in-law was brazen, convinced that fearlessness equaled power. She arrived one afternoon with a swagger and a new dress, and that smile that always meant she expected the room to bend. She said, "Why are you making a fuss? We just want what's fair." Her voice dripped entitlement like perfume. I set my tea down and looked at her the way one looks at someone who has misread a room. "Fair," I repeated. "Do you mean what you feel entitled to, or what the law reflects?" She flinched. She was not used to questions that pushed past tone and into fact. When she tried to be forceful, when she raised her voice in front of neighbors and hinted at the story, she wanted them to believe that the old woman had hoarded money and now refused to part with it. I observed the faces in the room. Some looked embarrassed, uncomfortable. Others had the knowing look of people who'd seen this type of behavior before. Nobody laughed. People stop laughing when there is paperwork and when community memory checks the version of events being offered. The public theater she hoped for evaporated into an awkward silence, and for a moment she looked like someone who had lost the script. My son's behavior was worse and more complicated. He shuffled between denial and defensiveness, trying to protect his choices and his wife, while also searching somewhere beneath it all for the moral compass he once had. He stopped visiting as casually. When he did come, his eyes avoided mine. I could see the conflict in the way he moved the old boy who once wanted to sit on my knee, and the adult who had made selfish choices both living in the same body. One night he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Mom, you have to understand. We thought you wouldn't need the money. We thought." The sentence collapsed into nothingness. I listened without interruption. "You thought without asking," I said. "You assumed without respect. I will not be asked to vanish so you can practice convenience. It is strange how many people equate old age with fragility. I used that to my advantage, but not in the way they expected. I became, publicly, the woman with the broken arm who nonetheless ran audits and met lawyers and quietly showed up at community meetings. The image of frailty made their arrogance even more exposed. They looked like bullies when contrasted with a woman who took notes and signed papers and asked calmly for accountability. The media smelled a story, although I never invited them. A local blogger, someone who had once covered our town's charity luncheons, called me and asked if my story was true. I told her it was true, that I had been assaulted, and that I had taken steps to secure what belonged to me. She published an account that was factual and restrained. The piece emphasized law and ownership, not scandal. It didn't need sensationalism. The facts were sharp enough. Public perception began to turn. The social circles that my daughter-in-law frequented grew quieter. Invitations became tentative. People who had once envied her now offered sympathetic nods to me over fences and at grocery store lines. A birthday party invitation was rescinded. A committee declined to accept a sponsorship from her quietly. A longtime friend who used to smile politely now cued me for a conversation and said, "Josephine, if you ever need anything," and meant it. Those small acknowledgments are how reputation heals and how it is reshaped. Legal pressure is slow but steady like water that, given enough time, can shape stone. As the audit progressed, things began to appear that the couple had assumed wouldn't be noticed. Unauthorized transfers, signatures without corroborating memos, rushed approvals that didn't match the documented procedures. The auditors did their work meticulously, using a language of numbers and timestamps that bruised pride differently than words do. My daughter-in-law texted furious messages and called late at night. My son answered with silence that spoke louder than either of them expected. "Everything will be fine." He told her one time, and I heard the tremor in his voice. Fine is not a plan. One of the quietest, most devastating moves I made was to protect the relationships around them. I reached out to the bank manager before the confrontation and asked for a simple assurance, please verify, before releasing any funds. I don't think the bank realized how important that little push was, but it made all the difference. When the couple appeared again at the counter, this time demanding immediate transfer, the teller politely but firmly said, "We have pending verification and cannot release funds until the documentation is complete." Their faces contorted in a blend of shock and anger. They had counted on heat and pressure to overrule process. They forgot that systems exist for a reason. My daughter-in-law tried the only tactic left to her, public performance. She composed posts on social media portraying herself as the victim of a greedy matriarch. She staged photos of family meals, of smiles, of theatrics meant to curry sympathy. People saw through the sheen. Social media is a hall of mirrors. The more you polish a lie, the clearer the cracks become. Comments arrived more cautious than supportive. Friends who had once doubled back on gossip now asked for specifics, then suggested restraint. The court of public opinion had not returned a verdict in my favor, merely because I presented a compelling morality play. It did so because her claims didn't align with documented facts and behaviors. In the middle of all this, I refused to let bitterness be my only companion. There were nights I cried, alone in the halfway light of my living room, feeling the weight of betrayal. I had loved my son, had raised him on stories of honesty and quiet work, and to see him side with brutality burned like acid. And yet, in my tears I found resolve. Anger without purpose is just a spark. Anger with a plan is fire that cooks the meat of truth until it is undeniable. I also reached out to people in the community who had been quietly wronged by similar opportunism. A small group formed not a mob, but a network of calm people who had been awakened by the same pattern of entitlement. They were not in it to shame. They wanted to ensure that kindness would not be taken as weakness. We met at first in quiet kitchens, then in a library room with legal pads and tea. They shared stories. We compared notes. Some agreed to act as character references if needed. Others offered contact information for professionals who could testify about proper procedures and corporate governance. The strength of a quiet coalition is that it is predictable and persistent. Predators tire quickly if the ground is already prepared. Meanwhile, life continued in small human ways. The granddaughter brought me colored drawings and demanded I display them on the fridge. I accepted cups of tea and clumsy hugs. The boy who had once been my son's shadow, the one who used to climb my lap at afternoon tea, now shifted whenever his mother raised her voice. I knelt to him one afternoon, careful with my arm, and said, "You don't need to be loud to be strong. Watch and learn." He looked at me with the unfiltered curiosity of a child, and in that gaze I found refuge. The most decisive turn came when the audit revealed a pattern of hurried decisions in accounts tied to my son's department purchases that didn't match invoices, transfers with dubious authorization, and expenses that could not be reconciled without signatures that were not on file. The board requested a meeting. The bank froze certain lines pending clarification. This was not drama, it was consequence. The couple had built a house of entitlement on shifting sand, and sand does not hold under pressure. I watched my son in those meetings and saw the boy beneath, shrunken but still there. He spoke less than he had before, and when he did, he was careful. I saw him write memos, reissue checks with proper documentation, call vendors with apologies and explanations. It was clumsy at first, but it was real. He was learning to be accountable in public and to face responsibility. That is the only kind of humility that matters, the kind that shows up when no one is watching, but the ledger is open and the signatures are blunt truth. And my daughter-in-law, she swung between rage and performance. She hired a flashy lawyer who liked to talk about aggressive defense. But aggression without evidence is empty rhetoric in a room full of auditors and legal minds. There were moments she tried to play the victim card, but the legal papers spoke louder than any staged photo. Her mother called me once, furious and threatening, and I listened, then responded calmly. Threats do not change fact. If you want this resolved, we will follow the steps required. She had no answer to the language of law and documentation. Pride had not prepared her for it. The hardest part, emotionally, was watching family dinners turn into practice in measured conversation. We no longer raged, we accounted. We asked, documented, and then tried to rebuild. At first it felt like the death of warmth. Later I realized it was the birth of a different intimacy, one with boundaries that did not allow exploitation. My son began to come by with paperwork rather than excuses, and I began to speak less in sermons and more in shared actions. He did small things that mattered. He fixed a wobbly porch step. He sat with me in the garden and listened to me name the roses by color and care. Those gestures are not fireworks, but they thread a life back together strand by quiet strand. By the time the auditors issued their report, conclusions were clear. Certain transfers were unauthorized. Procedures had been sidestepped. There had been negligence that could no longer be explained away by ignorance. Recommendations followed: restitution, corrected documentation, and a requirement for oversight. The consequences were practical, enforceable, and importantly, educational. They demanded repair, not ruin. That was my aim all along, to force accountability that taught rather than to destroy. When the board met to consider the recommendations, I sat in the meeting room with family members who had once looked away, now sitting beside me as allies in governance. There was no gloating, only a firm insistence on standards. My son stood when it was his time to speak and said plainly, "I made mistakes, I will make them right." The room accepted that as a starting point. He had to earn trust back, and trust is a ledger kept in daily entries. In the quiet after the verdict, my daughter-in-law left town for a few weeks, the way some people take long trips to avoid facing the quiet truth at home. She returned later, quieter, rehearsed in apologies that smelled like effort. It's different when the theater is gone and the consequences remain. She had to rebuild not an image, but a practice of behavior. That is harder and slower in its excavation, but more reliable if done honestly. When I reflect on those months, I see now that the most important moves were not legal filings or boardroom memos, although those were necessary. The crucial shifts happened in daily choices: refusing to be minimized, documenting everything, insisting on procedure, and teaching my son that protection is not silence. I taught them not by shouting, not by spectacle, but by making the rules plain and insisting they be followed. It is tedious work, yes, but it is also how families and institutions heal. There were evenings when I still winced reaching for a cup, when the memory of the strike came like a flash. But with each intentional step, each audited page, each rewritten memo, each apology made with follow-up action, I felt strength regrow in different parts of me. The arm would mend, the habits they had learned would change more slowly. I held to the thought that dignity is not a gift to be handed out by others. It is a state you insist on and guard. One late afternoon, my son came into the garden with 2 mugs of tea and sat beside me without preamble. He handed me a note with the first line, "I am sorry," written in a hand that had once been careless. Below, page after page detailed changes he was implementing: new checks and balances, oversight protocols, meetings with vendors to repair miscommunications. It was not grand, it was accountable. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket like a small talisman. "Good," I said simply. He smiled, tired and relieved. "We'll keep doing it," he promised. That is what I asked of them: consistency, not theatrics. Restitution, not revenge. Responsibility, not entitlement. And in the months that followed, those things looked more possible than they had when my arm was broken and their greed was loud. They had learned the cost of easy assumptions. I had reclaimed what was mine not through spectacle but through steady, unyielding insistence on truth. And yet I knew there were more steps ahead: reconciliation, yes, but also boundary, setting that would last a lifetime. The ledger had been balanced in principle, but the work of relationship is a daily accounting. I was ready for it. I had always been ready to do the long work. The next part of our lives would not erase the past, but it would be built on clearer ground. If you want, I will continue with part 3, where the tides turn further, where their pride contorts into real attempts at repair, where my daughter-in-law's posturing breaks into genuine admission, and where my son slowly remakes himself into someone worthy of the family name. The weeks after the bank confrontation were quieter, but the quiet was deceptive. It was not peace, it was the calm before recognition sank fully into their bones. I watched my daughter-in-law move through the house with her usual bravado, but her steps were measured now. The kind of careful pacing people adopt when they realize the terrain they assumed was theirs has shifted beneath them. Every glance at me held hesitation. She no longer barged in demanding attention or compliance. She hovered, testing the waters, unsure whether I would rise to meet her defiance or let the law and truth do the talking. I did neither. I simply existed, calm and patient, letting the weight of her own choices settle. My son, once brimming with misplaced confidence, now carried the air of a man learning accountability the hard way. At first, he attempted to speak over me to minimize the lessons he had learned the hard way. But every time he tried, I held my ground. I asked questions quietly, precisely, without raising my voice about every decision, every transfer, every assumption that had been made without me. The room became a place of reflection. Slowly, he stopped arguing. Slowly, he began to listen. And as he listened, he began to understand not only my strength, but also the fragility of arrogance when it is tested by someone who refuses to be intimidated. One evening, I invited them both into the living room under the pretense of casual conversation. The air was still tense, but I allowed it to linger like a curtain before a revelation. I spoke calmly, deliberately, recounting small moments they had overlooked, how every decision they had rushed had consequences they couldn't yet see. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand apology. I simply told the truth, layer by layer, in a narrative they could not argue with. I spoke of fairness, law, and respect. I spoke of patience and strategy. I spoke in the language they could not deny, facts. Their faces changed. My daughter-in-law's sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear and disbelief. She realized that no theatrics, no public posturing, no manipulation of tone could undo the reality I presented. She was forced to confront that the foundation she had built her arrogance upon, the belief that fear and dominance could secure her claim, was hollow. My son's pride cracked, too. His once cocky confidence gave way to unease as he understood that his mother's guidance had been ignored at his own peril. He had underestimated me, and the reality of that underestimation began to weigh heavily on him. The next morning, I received a call from the bank manager. He was careful, professional, but I could hear the shift in his tone. He had witnessed the confrontation and now fully understood the meticulous groundwork I had laid. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said softly, "I just want to confirm everything is proceeding correctly. Your instructions are clear, and your documentation is impeccable." I thanked him, of course, but the truth was clear. The bank now recognized not only my legal standing, but also my presence as a force of consequence. No amount of intimidation would sway them now. With that, I began the next phase of my quiet strategy: observation and control. I watched my daughter-in-law navigate daily life with increasing difficulty. Simple tasks she had taken for granted, managing schedules, talking to neighbors, handling household responsibilities, suddenly demanded competence she hadn't cultivated. The more she struggled, the more her confidence faltered. Each mistake, each faltered attempt at authority, reminded her of the quiet, steady force she had tried to dismiss. And every time she faltered, I simply observed, letting her confront the reality she had ignored for so long. My son's transformation was slower, subtler. He began to write memos, draft schedules, and double-check financial decisions with genuine diligence. The first time he came to me for advice rather than excuses, I almost didn't recognize the boy I had raised. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, I sensed that he was beginning to internalize the lessons that had been delivered with both firmness and consequence. I allowed him space to learn, intervening only when necessary, guiding silently from the background. True learning, I knew, required autonomy within boundaries. One afternoon, the daughter-in-law attempted to confront me directly, her tone sharper than usual, though her eyes betrayed hesitation. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said. I looked at her steadily, calmly, without flinching. "Winning has nothing to do with pride," I said. "It has to do with fairness, responsibility, and consequences. You will learn that eventually, with or without me." She recoiled slightly, the words striking deeper than any argument could have. That was the point. I wasn't here to humiliate, I was here to educate. The lesson was in the quiet authority I wielded, the patience I exercised, and the inevitability of accountability. Days passed, and the household shifted imperceptibly but undeniably. The daughter-in-law's demands grew softer, her voice less certain. My son no longer shielded her with arrogance. He began to act cautiously, observing my decisions and listening when I offered guidance. I had not changed, I had only held steady, allowed time and facts to work as allies. They were learning that the world responds not to bluster, but to preparation, patience, and integrity. Then came the first public acknowledgement. During a community meeting, the daughter-in-law attempted to assert herself as a model of efficiency and family management. She was interrupted by the very paperwork she had assumed I wouldn't notice, and she had to step back while documents were reviewed publicly. My son's initial embarrassment turned into silent acceptance. He could not argue with the clarity of record and the weight of truth. The lesson was complete, and the silence that followed was profound. Pride had met consequence, and humility had begun its quiet, stubborn work. By this point, I had noticed subtle changes in myself as well. The pain from my broken arm was fading, replaced by a sense of renewed strength. I had faced aggression, arrogance, and betrayal, and had not reacted with hatred or impulsive fury. Instead, I had allowed truth, patience, and careful action to create justice. And I understood more clearly than ever that retaliation need not be loud to be effective. It need only be precise and deliberate. The daughter-in-law eventually began small gestures of acknowledgement, tentative apologies wrapped in awkward phrasing, yet genuine in intent. My son, too, acted with growing responsibility, often consulting me before decisions and making adjustments based on guidance rather than impulse. I let these changes unfold naturally, knowing that authentic transformation requires observation, support, and a firm framework. By the end of Part 3, the household was quieter, but the quiet was a sign of comprehension, not submission. My daughter-in-law had begun to recognize the limits of her power. My son had begun to internalize responsibility, and I had reinforced my position not through threats or anger, but through steadfast presence, preparation, and the unflinching application of consequence. The foundation had shifted, and life could continue, tempered by respect and awareness. The house felt different. The energy had shifted, subtle but unmistakable. My daughter-in-law moved carefully, her every step measured as if the air itself reminded her of past arrogance. My son's shoulders, once confident and careless, now carried a weight of awareness. I had not yelled, I had not schemed wildly, but the combination of patience, preparation, and unyielding truth had changed the landscape entirely. The next confrontation came on a seemingly ordinary afternoon. I had invited my son and daughter-in-law into the living room for a conversation I had long been preparing for. My arm had healed enough that I could gesture freely, to emphasize the points that words alone could not convey. I wanted them to fully grasp the consequences of greed and pride. The moment they entered, I didn't rise or flinch. I simply looked at them with calm authority, the kind that silences even the boldest threats. You have both assumed that money could override respect, law, and family bonds. I began, my voice steady, deliberate. You have learned, perhaps slowly, that it cannot. My daughter-in-law's eyes flicked away, uncomfortable, while my son's gaze fell to the floor. I continued without pause today. We are going to finalize what has already been set in motion. There is no anger here, only clarity. Every action has consequences, and you will face them fully. I laid out the documentation I had gathered over weeks. Audits, legal confirmations, and verified records that proved the money belonged entirely to me. The air in the room was tense, and I let it stay that way. Neither of them could speak. Words would only falter in the presence of absolute truth. Their prior arrogance had blinded them, but now, faced with unassailable facts, they were forced to reckon. My daughter-in-law tried a last attempt at manipulation. "You are being dramatic, Josephine. Can't we just—" Her words trailed off as she realized the futility. I let silence answer her, letting the weight of consequence sink in. Pride is loud, but reality speaks quietly. That quiet, deliberate presence of law, truth, and preparation hits harder than any shout. My son finally looked up. "Mom, I didn't understand." His voice was small, hesitant, the kind of voice that only comes after realization dawns fully. I didn't interrupt. I let him feel the truth of his choices, the gravity of siding with arrogance over justice. He swallowed, nodded, and began to take notes, acknowledging the procedures and the steps required to make restitution. This was not public shaming, it was private accountability, and it mattered more than any spectacle could. The final act of this chapter unfolded quietly over the next few days. The daughter-in-law had to face her mistakes publicly in the context of the community and at the bank. Every document she had ignored, every demand she had made, was now accounted for. She had no recourse, no clever words to circumvent truth. The bank froze transfers until proper verification and approvals were completed. She attempted to argue, but each step had been anticipated. Her words fell flat, powerless against careful preparation and unassailable facts. I observed, calm and steady. There was no joy in watching them falter, only satisfaction in justice being served. Sometimes people need to see their own arrogance reflected back at them in a mirror of truth. That mirror had been prepared carefully, and they could not look away. My son, now quieter, began following the rules without argument, gradually rebuilding trust. It was the daughter-in-law's own miscalculations that sealed her fate in my eyes. She underestimated patience, underplayed evidence, and overplayed her confidence. The subtle corrections I implemented, ensuring public records, legal verification, and oversight, were like a web tightening slowly, inevitably. By the end of the week, she understood fully that the house, the money, and the respect within it could not be claimed by force, by demand, or by arrogance. I didn't need to raise my voice, threaten, or humiliate. The transformation happened quietly. She became careful, hesitant, calculating before acting. My son became responsible, mindful of choices, and respectful of boundaries. And I remained unshaken, the calm center of the storm I had navigated with precision and patience. There is power in preparation, in quiet observation, in strategic patience. By the time the final consequences were clear, funds secured legally, boundaries respected, and accountability established, I understood the most important lesson had already been delivered. True strength is measured not by intimidation or loudness, but by clarity, foresight, and the willingness to act decisively while remaining composed. The house was peaceful, but it was a different kind of peace now. It was not the peace of ignorance or submission. It was the peace of respect earned, lessons internalized, and consequences understood. My daughter-in-law no longer moved with certainty. My son no longer assumed freedom from responsibility. And I, Josephine, remained the quiet, deliberate force that had turned arrogance into understanding, cruelty into accountability, and greed into a lesson they would never forget. That day I realized something crucial. Victory is not about spectacle, revenge, or power displays. Victory is about clarity, patience, and ensuring that truth prevails, and I had achieved it. Every step, every quiet calculation, every deliberate pause had led to this. A family that now understood the consequences of entitlement, and a woman who had reclaimed her dignity without compromise. The days of confrontation, documentation, and quiet strategy had built a framework that even arrogance could not undo. My daughter-in-law, once bold and fearless in her demands, now moved cautiously, aware that every step could have consequences. My son, who had once stood blindly beside her, now carried the weight of responsibility with a careful, measured posture. And I, Josephine, remained the calm center, the steady force guiding the outcome without raising my voice or losing composure. The last meeting with the bank and legal representatives was understated yet decisive. I entered with my arm fully healed, carrying only a small briefcase, my presence calm and authoritative. My daughter-in-law followed, attempting to appear confident, but her steps were unsure, and the faint tremor in her hand betrayed the realization that this was no longer her domain. My son walked beside her, shoulders hunched slightly, eyes avoiding mine, not in fear, but in recognition of the lessons he had learned too late. The bank manager greeted me with polite formality, but I could sense his respect. Weeks of preparation, documentation, and careful oversight had created an unassailable position. I presented the final papers outlining ownership, proper authorizations, and the path for restitution. Each signature, each notarized line, reinforced the truth that had long been ignored. No words of entitlement, no demands, no bravado could alter reality. My daughter-in-law attempted one last assertion, a faint edge in her voice, a claim that she was owed consideration. I looked at her steadily, calm, and said, "Consideration comes with respect, responsibility, and truth. You have ignored all three. This is what you will do to make amends." She faltered, realizing that negotiation was impossible without accountability. Pride crumbled quietly, like sand slipping through fingers. My son spoke next, his voice careful, deliberate. "Mom, I understand now. I will ensure everything is corrected, and I will take responsibility for the mistakes I've made." There was no bravado, no deflection. Just the quiet acknowledgement of truth and the first signs of genuine accountability. I nodded, allowing him the space to make right the wrongs, while knowing the process was irreversible once begun. The weeks that followed cemented the transformation. My daughter-in-law adjusted her behavior, learning the hard way that intimidation and entitlement are powerless against patience, planning, and the rule of law. She began following procedures, respecting boundaries, and treating others, including me, with the acknowledgement that actions have consequences. My son grew into a responsible man, consulting, verifying, and acting with integrity. Their previous arrogance had been replaced with careful humility. Not theatrics, not pretend compliance, but authentic learning. At home, life resumed with a new rhythm. I walked through the rooms with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had faced violence, betrayal, and greed, and emerged unbroken. The arm that had once been broken was fully healed, a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. I maintained my routines, my voice calm, my authority quiet but undeniable. Respect was restored, not demanded but earned through patience and truth. One afternoon, my granddaughter handed me a drawing she had made, a small act of affection that reminded me of what mattered beyond money or conflict. I smiled, placing it on the fridge. My daughter-in-law watched silently, understanding, finally, that family is not a stage for entitlement, but a space for accountability. My son stood beside me, quietly observing, ready to act with care and responsibility. The household, once fractured by greed and arrogance, now held a balance I had fought to achieve. I realized, as I sat in the sunlight streaming through the living room windows, that the most powerful victories are quiet. They do not need shouts, threats, or dramatic displays. They require patience, planning, observation, and the courage to remain calm in the face of chaos. My retaliation had not been loud. It had been deliberate, strategic, and relentless in its precision. And in the end, it had reshaped my family, restored my dignity, and ensured that greed and arrogance would never again dominate this house. Looking at my son, my daughter-in-law, and the small faces of the next generation, I felt a deep, calm satisfaction. Justice had been served, but it had been served with intelligence, integrity, and restraint. My legacy, I realized, would not be defined by the lottery I had won, but by the wisdom, patience, and courage I had exercised in protecting what was rightfully mine. And so, I, Josephine, the woman they thought they could overpower, remained the quiet, unyielding force that transformed arrogance into humility, entitlement into accountability, and fear into understanding. The lesson had been learned fully, the consequences endured, and the household rebuilt on respect, truth, and careful stewardship. This was my victory. Not loud, not brash, but absolute and lasting.